All right, good afternoon again. Our first speaker in our second breakout session on sagebrush steppe restoration techniques is Dr. Bruce Roundy. Bruce is currently a professor of range science at the Plant and Wildlife Sciences Department at Brigham Young University. He's been there for the last 13 years. His main research interests are the effects of disturbance on plants, as well as restoration ecology. He's previously taught and conducted research at the University of Arizona in Tucson for over 10 years and conducted range research for USDA ARS in Reno, Nevada. And Bruce is also an alumnus of Utah State University. He got his PhD in range management here. With that, he will be presenting sagebrush steppe restoration situations and techniques. Will you please help me welcome Bruce Roundy?
Okay, glad to be here. I'm going to kind of run through a number of research projects we've been involved in relating to sagebrush restoration. So it'll be kind of like the joke that's told here. You know, a minister came to church and there was one cowboy there, but he said, "Hey, I got the whole sermon," so he gave it to him. An hour later, he went down and asked the cowboy how it was, and the cowboy said, "Well, you know, when one cow shows up, I don't give him the whole load of hay. But you're going to get the whole load of hay as much as I can give it to you here." A number of former graduate students and current employees are in the audience, and hopefully they won't contradict the results I have come to from their studies. I'm going to talk about mechanisms of succession, where you do mechanistic research that helps you decide how to apply disturbance, what controls weed invasion and dominance. I'll talk about some experiments where we did vegetation renovation or establishment, including mechanical treatment of some sagebrush stands. Some current experiments where we're trying to diversify crested wheatgrass stands based on this assisted succession idea. And then some of the science of establishment, what's controlling whether things germinate and grow or not, and can you model that? Then I'll also finish up here with some fire rehabilitation studies that were done at a large scale and look at some things we did there. As you look at, you know, this is kind of like your model of life, how life works, only from a plant ecology standpoint. What causes cheatgrass to be able to invade? What lack of disturbance or disturbance could cause that? At what point should we have a disturbance to prevent tree encroachment from pygmy conifers or Robin Tausch's slides from Underdown Canyon in Nevada? You know, and that would help us decide how to manage for what we have and when to apply disturbance to keep what we'd like to keep. So there's some research here we're currently conducting relative to that. You all have probably heard of sage steppe. It involves scientists and land managers like these dudes here from the Salt Lake Field Office watching a prescribed burn, and Brad Washout from the State BLM office. Here we're trying to ask the question, at what stage of understory density cover and tree overstory density and cover should we apply treatments like fire, cutting, or even bullhog mastication, which just rips a tree into shreds, to save our understory native perennial community? If we can apply it at the right stage, we won't lose it and have to go into the costly revegetation or concern about losing our site to weeds. And that's ongoing with over 18 different science partners and an equivalent number of agency people in different BLM and Forest Service offices working to implement these treatments on sagebrush and cheatgrass, as well as on pinyon and juniper and western juniper woodlands across the Great Basin. So we're applying these treatments across a range of these tree densities or understory ratios to ask the question, when is it best to do that? Here's a graph of Rick Miller's from western juniper, and you can see juniper increasing in cover here as shrubs decrease At some point here, there's a biotic threshold that if you do have a disturbance, you won't get your shrubs or understory back. We want to know where that is and how that works across a number of sites in the Great Basin, hence all this work, network of work. And the whole idea is, apply a treatment before you get this loss so that you can maintain or get that back without doing revegetation like this site had done. What about invasion research? Gene Chambers and a bunch of us did a study on lower, mid, and higher elevation sagebrush sites. We had three of those sites in Nevada, plus a crested wheatgrass site, 3 in Utah, plus a crested and a squirreltail site, where we did a number of different things, like remove the understory competition. So we sprayed out the perennial herbaceous grasses, or we sprayed and burned to eliminate the sagebrush shrub. And then we seeded cheatgrass in. You can imagine the BLM was just delighted when we told them we wanted to do these treatments, but it was done on a small scale. And we wanted to ask the question, what causes Great Basin communities to be invasible? And Jean has recently published an ecological monograph article this year on that study. And in a nutshell, what she basically found, and it's hard to read from this graph, but if you reduce the perennial herbaceous grass component by taking it out with an herbicide or something, you get much more seed production and biomass production of cheatgrass across these sites. Or if you have more fluctuating available water, so that there are times where there's a lot more available water than other times, you also provide the resource for invasion of cheatgrass. Therefore, on the lower elevation sites, you had much more growth and production of cheatgrass than you did on the higher elevation sites where there was less fluctuation and maybe some temperature control constraints to cheatgrass seed production. Take-home message, maintain your perennial herbaceous understory. We also, in conjunction with this study, measured soil moisture and temperature, and we asked the question, does disturbance, what's the relative effect of disturbance versus weather on the ability of cheatgrass to germinate? Because if you want to understand why something invades that's an annual, you have to ask, okay, does it germinate? What abiotic constraints are there to germination? Does it grow, merge and produce seeds? How does that affect seed production, growth, and sustaining itself, renewing itself? So the first question, germination. Stuart Hardigree and I modeled some 18 different collections of cheatgrass. You can look at how fast cheatgrass germinates in relation to temperature. Cheatgrass roughly needs around 1,000 degree hours to get for 50% of the population to germinate. Now that varies with the temperature it's at. If you're at 15 degrees C for 1 hour, you just accumulated 15 degree hours. So it's a little complex, but it's really fairly simple. Then you can put soil moisture data with that and say, how many times do you think you would have a wet period in the fall, winter, or spring where you would accumulate enough degree hours to germinate 25 or 50% of the cheatgrass? And then you can use this model, kind of ecophysiological model, to predict that. And over here we did that, and we have a paper that will come out in Range Ecology and Management. If you constrain it so you have to have that heat accumulation during one wet period, it comes to about the same result as if you can accumulate that heat across intermittent wet periods. And what we found out is on our 9 sites, most falls, all springs, just about all springs, and practically none of the winters, but a few of them, you accumulate enough degree hours for germination. And that doesn't matter whether you disturb the community or not. It comes because cheatgrass is well suited to the weather and the climate in the Great Basin, as has been mentioned. So you're not going to stop it at the germination stage. Take-home message, you're going to have competing vegetation there to stop it at the seed production, seedling survival, and spread stage. It may be there, but it won't dominate if it's got competing resources. And of course that could vary with site. Susan Meyer, Phil Allen, and I have a plot at the Spanish Fork Farm at BYU. We established 6 different kinds of plant communities. 2 different native grasses alone, those native grasses together, those native grasses with shrubs, mountain big sagebrush and a rabbit brush, Chrysothemis nauseosus, rubber rabbit brush, and then those shrubs and grasses with forbs, and then just grasses with the forbs. So this plant diversity, the different type of life form, does it make a difference on weed establishment? And then, craziest of craziest ideas, we seeded 3 different annual grasses into these plant communities: goat grass, cheatgrass, and cereal rye on different subplots. And it's a very fertile site, and it rained right after we seeded into this communities that had been established for a couple years. And basically what we found with all these bar graphs here is if you had shrubs in the mix, you tended to reduce the weed seed production, but not enough. We didn't create a community, not one, and we had those 6 communities, and then we had the same 6 doubled in density. We didn't create a community that stopped those weeds. We could not create a weed-resistant community. Now, maybe over time that might happen, and it's a wait-and-see kind of thing, but right now we're decreasing numbers of production of weed seeds, but it's still enough to keep the weeds in there. And so it's how much is enough makes a difference kind of thing. So ongoing weed resistance research. But the bottom line, and I know you're going to find exceptions, but boy, if you've got a good perennial herbaceous understory mixed with shrubs, let's don't graze the thing out. We know we don't need to do that. Let's practice moderate grazing, like Jerry Holochek tells us, and let's maintain that community, and we'll have less cheatgrass invasion if we have any of these sites left. And I think we have some left. And it seems like I've seen quite a few of those, more now than at the beginning of my career. How about sagebrush renovation? Danny Summers is here. He conducted this study on desert land and livestock area, and you probably won't go to that tomorrow, but you'll see something like it. The question was, we have a decadent stand of sagebrush, and decadence defined as like 20% of the brushes of the sagebrush plant is dead. Then let's do something to renovate it and increase the understory. So they went in with a number of different mechanical treatments and then seeded in. Afterwards, here's the mix. You see a lot of Division of Wildlife Resources who really supported this project. They seed quite a few introduced species because I think they work in the real world and they need to get things that are supportive of wildlife no matter where they came from. But so you see natives and introduced species there. What did they find out? Well, the more you disturb the sagebrush, the harder it is on it. So two-way harrowing, 67% mortality, disking, up here, over 90% mortality. All the mechanical treatments, here's the undisturbed here, all the mechanical treatments reduce cover and density of sagebrush. But most of the other ones, besides two-way harrow and disc, was around 50% mortality. So you're leaving a lot of plants there and they'll have greater growth. Danny found out after you disturb them and kill half their neighbors. The interesting thing was in this plant community there were quite a few residual species, and they did pretty good. They came up pretty good no matter what you did. But if you really disturbed them, like chaining and imprinting, you took them out, but then the reseeding, which is the maroon bars, did really a lot better. So, it's kind of like if you've got a good residual community, you don't necessarily have to reseed. But if you do have to reseed, maybe you have to knock it back a little more to have more success. This was an operational scale replicated experiment. We need more of those to come up with these kind of conclusions. Dr. Anderson, Val Anderson, who's now my department chair, so I have to be careful what I say, but he started this idea of assisted succession. Great idea. We got some native seed money, and now, we have this study where we're trying from an operational scale to see if you can actually convert a crested wheatgrass stand to a native community. And so we have these on two different sites in Skull Valley and also in Rush Valley. We have this experimental design of 5 blocks, 2 different years of installation. We have 4 different control methods, 2-way disc versus 1-way disc. So one we call full control mechanical versus partial control mechanical. We had 2 different rates of Roundup as an herbicide treatment. I think this slide changer works by hand temperature. So I'm putting it down. And then we had a seeding mix that we seeded in there, and we also left half the plots unseeded because we say, what if the seeding fails? Are we going to have some weed invasion? So we're interested in crested wheatgrass control. Can we establish native plants by seeding? And what happens to weed invasion? April Hewlett, who is here, has a poster that she'll present tonight in detail. I'll just hit a highlight or two. There's the species that we seeded, natives, including some shrubs there. In fact, we had 2 different ways we seeded, but we seeded out of the new Truax drill. And we drill seeded in both species, but this was broadcast in between those rows that were drilled, the small seeded species like the sandbergs and the Wyoming sagebrush. And you can see kind of how that works here, the different seed boxes. Where we drilled the grasses in, it's just these, it's not an offset disc, it's just a concentric disc, opens up a slot and drops in the seed, so you get very minimum tillage compared to the rangeland drill, and pretty good, excellent seed depth control. Where you drop the seeds on top, the small seeded species, you just have this brilliant packer wheel go over the top. It's supposed to be just the right thing to do, and we did that. What did we find out? I can't present all the results, but it's hard to control crested wheatgrass, and maybe I have a hard time controlling it and killing sagebrush. Jason Vernon said, didn't you try to do the thing the other way around in the first of your career? And I said, yeah, well, maybe that's it, Anyway, we didn't control crested wheatgrass really well, but the full control mechanical, the 2-way disc did the best, but we still had a lot of crested left. A year later, after doing the treatment the second year, it's still there. And we also have quite a seed bank of crested that came back up. So if you really want to knock crested out, you may have to do subsequent treatments there. What about cheatgrass? On Lookout Pass, we didn't have a lot of cheatgrass on this site. At the Skull Valley site we did, but I'm presenting these results. We got a lot more cheatgrass in those areas we disturbed the second year. So, it's coming up. It was knocked down by the herbicide treatment, which may have actually been applied in the spring, may have actually killed some of the growing cheatgrass and reduced the seed bank. But the mechanical, the most disturbance, created the most cheatgrass. What about our seeded species? We got things. We didn't get as much yarrow and we didn't get as much sagebrush. This was the only sagebrush we got, and I took a picture of it there. Actually, we got maybe 5 or 10, but it was disappointing. We didn't get a lot of sagebrush. We did get a lot of native grass, sandbergs, and blue bunch wheatgrass. They kind of established the same over the treatments, and like April will tell you, time will tell how well this works out. In conjunction with that study, we thought we'd like to try to model whether we could model germination of seeded species just like we did cheatgrass. So we measured soil temperature and moisture in small plots adjacent to the large plots, and then also followed seedling emergence and demography over time. Planted a bunch of seed packets and retrieved them and determined whether they germinated and whether our model would have predicted they would have accumulated enough thermal time when the seedbed was wet to have predicted germination. This is 1 year of seedings and retrievals. We have another whole year that we're analyzing right now. you know, here's water potential, goes all over the place, and here's seed bed temperature. Well, how do you make sense out of this? Well, again, you accumulate time. When it's wet, that you get progress toward germination by accumulating degree hours, and then you can model whether you think it would germinate or not. Just quickly, because I have to move along here, we had pretty good agreement. We can pretty well predict by this wet accumulation model of germinable species that they're going to germinate in seed bags. Unfortunately, we don't seed in seed bags. We seed without seed bags, and we don't predict that as well. But it looks like here's a mechanism to maybe do some comparisons of different species and see what their likelihood for germinating under different climatic and weather scenarios. And Stuart and I will continue to work on that. And Jennifer Coleman will write her thesis on this. She followed seedling density on these small plots, and I just throw this in there. Many people have shown that we get pretty good germination and then our seedlings die in seedings, and this kind of shows that. And you know, here's the winner up here, Cheatgrass. Here's Crested right below it, and Blue Bunch coming in third. So, you know, there's a reason sometimes we don't see as much of the native species, and there may be other mechanisms. We can also model seminal root growth by heat accumulation, and we're starting to do that. Large-scale tools are needed, as we can't do ecological gardening and save the Great Basin. We can maybe have little relics left, like the Curtis Prairie, you know, back in the Midwest, but we've got to use large-scale tools. And so we've done some studies. Fire rehab is the biggest application of range seeding in the country. I mean, that's what we do. We put more seed out due to fire rehabilitation than any other reason. So this is the study that Dr. Anderson reported for us, and in the interest of time, I'll just say the important thing about this study was it was operational scale and it was replicated in space. And it also took a whole fall of logistics to work with the agencies to make sure this happened correctly. And we learned a lot about it. We had a drill site after the 1999 fire, railroad fire. We had an aerial seeding site. We replicated it over 5 replications. The drill site, 2 of those reps completely failed because the soils were sandy and we think we buried the seed too deep. So, you know, you learn that. The aerial seeding site did a lot better. He's already showed you the costs. It's a lot more expensive. We call this the low because it was a lower diversity. We had fewer species. This was the high because it was a higher diversity and increased the rate. What did we find out? In general, we found out on the drill site you needed a higher seeding rate to be as successful as the ARS or BLM mix. On the aerial seeding site, both the low and high diversity rates were as good as the ARS and BLM mixes. So you can establish native species, but you might have to seed them at a higher rate, and time will tell how well those do. We seeded sagebrush and didn't have much success with sagebrush. With sagebrush or any other species, you got to put it in the right place, right microenvironment. It likes to be just kind of pressed into the surface of the soil. The challenge is establishing a diverse plant community. When you're just doing it from seeding, you got different sizes, shapes, and depth requirements. So you need specialized drills that are much more sophisticated than the old rangeland drill. And so here's that Truax drill, and it helps put that seed in the right place. Looking at that, what do we do in large-scale seedings where we can't get a drill in there? So here's a couple of studies that were done. Jeff Odd, Grant MacArthur, and myself. There was a fire in 1996, a large fire, complex of fires in Utah. I'll talk about that. We've studied wildfire rehabilitation success in the Henry Mountains with and without chaining. And then I wanted to mention just some of the things DWR is doing to establish sagebrush and success they've had. With this 1996 complex fire, the BLM didn't do their archaeological homework, so they were shut down. It created a paired study where you could have chained and unchained areas that had been broadcast seeded. Jeff Ott went out and measured these in great detail. That pretty well tells the story right there. Now, the mix was mainly introduced species. The Fillmore Field Office is often seeded with mainly introduced species: crested wheatgrass, tall wheatgrass, intermediate, pubescent. Maybe they'll throw in a little blue bunch, but it's mainly introduced grasses. The unchained areas were dominated by cheatgrass, and the chained areas after seeding were dominated by seeded introduced species. You have to bury the seed, like we've been teaching range students for years, or you'll get limited success. However, we went to the Bulldog fire, which burned in fall of summer 2003, if I remember correctly. And Jim Davis and his crew measured what happened, and I went up and did some measurements. What happened after, you had two different areas. You had a wilderness study area where you can't do any chaining and you seeded native species, and then you had some state land and BLM non-wilderness study area where they could chain, they could broadcast, they could seed introduced species. This illustrates the problem of doing rehab studies. We found that the chaining treatment was often confounded with seed mix, so here it was unchained and seeded with one mix, and here it was chained and seeded with another mix. So if you get a difference, what's it due to? Well, you don't know for sure. That's why you can't publish these things in refereed journals, but yet they're useful information. And there were some sites where we had the same mix and the chain versus non-chain. This was higher elevation. What we found in a nutshell there was that and they used a lot of yarrow in the unchained area, which is a native species where they get the seed from New Zealand. So figure that one out. Okay, so we used this native seed from New Zealand here, and it did real well because it's a small seeded species, requires light to germinate. Diuretic soils help cover it maybe a little. It was a very wet spring after seeding. What we basically found out in a nutshell is on some sites chaining increased establishment, but establishment was pretty good even without chaining. Would I ever tell you to not cover the seed? No. I think we were lucky here, higher elevation. Anyway, we were lucky. I think normally you want to chain to cover the seed. What has Jason Vernon done? He's okay. And DWR has been pretty successful in fire rehab. They've gone in and chained or broadcast seeded their grasses in, and then they've chained, and then when they finally get their seed, because it takes a while to get their seed later on in the fall and into the winter, November, December, they'll come in and broadcast into this roughened seed bed with sagebrush, and they've been pretty successful doing that. Conclusions, some quick ones here. Maintain your residuals to discourage weed dominance. We may have some models to compare how likely things are to establish versus weeds with thermal accumulation. We can alter our existing communities, but there may be a trade-off between how much control we get and how much understory establishment. And native species can establish at operational scales, but large-scale, replicated operational scale research is needed. Thank you. I think I have some time for a question or two. Oh, here's the last slide. I forgot the last one. Dr. Anderson said we got to do something. I agree. We could worry about genetics of native species. In the meantime, you know, if the house is burning down, you don't study the theory of combustion. You got to go do something. In the meantime, the mechanistic research is really important to tell us what to do eventually and how to do it. Okay.
Thank you.